All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining our second session in our Threat Intelligence Foundation series. I am Paul Jaramillo, Director of Hunt and Intelligence with Sophos MDR.
And I am Morgan Demboski. I'm a Threat Intelligence Analyst with Sophos MDR.
And some of you may recognize Morgan from her this summer's Black Hat presentation with her colleague Mark Parsons. If you haven't checked it out yet, Crimson Palace, it was a great threat hunt that uncovered some Chinese espionage. You can read all about that on news.sophos.com. But today we're going to kind of go over, how intelligence works and kind of give you guys some education here on the background on how something like that, a threat hunt, can turn into a uncovering an espionage campaign. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to kind of cover the steps of analyzing a new incident and how we might cluster that and step through some of the technical parts of like what is an indicator or an observable, and then kind of wrap up with what are some of the outcomes that come from threat intelligence. So with that, Morgan, as you're working as an intelligence analyst, what are your first steps when taking on a new incident and looking at it from an intelligence perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to the initial steps in analyzing an incident, when a new case is created by our managed detection and response or our rapid response teams, we ingest those playbooks or those spreadsheets that contain the activity timeline and the indicators of compromise into our threat intelligence platform that we use, which is called OpenCTI. And once we ingest those cases, us analysts will review the timeline and all of the incident details, and we'll begin to enrich the case in the platform with all of the necessary details and relationships. And the reason that we do this is to have a centralized intelligence platform containing all of the attack data from the cases that we respond to within the Sophos customer base. And so we can go in and we can add details to the case, like relevant labels, descriptions, external references, but we can also create relations between the incident and other entities like victim sector and country, different tool and malware profiles, vulnerabilities and initial access vectors. And through enriching the cases and creating relationships in the platform, we can begin to analyze trends and identify commonalities among cases, which enables us to conduct threat activity clustering.
Yeah, that's perfect. So threat activity clusters, can you kind of explain to the audience what is a threat activity cluster?
That is a great question. A threat activity cluster is basically a group of related threat activity exhibiting a specific pattern of behavior that can serve as a basis for tracking. So what that means is in any given attack, a threat actor will perform multiple actions on a target system, often following a specific order of operations, which will leave behind a series of observable artifacts that can be used as a point of comparison to identify similar activities across different attacks. And the goal behind threat clusters is to have a group of specific observable artifacts or data points that can serve as a strong basis for identifying activity by the same operator in future incidents.
Interesting. So it really ties together things that look separate and now they're kind of together now and helps you kind of do further conclusions. So exactly how does Sophos approach threat activity clustering?
So like a lot of different vendors out there, Sophos approaches threat clustering in its own way. So at Sophos, we use the moniker STAC, or Security Threat Activity Cluster, to track different clusters of attacker behavior. And so when we identify a group of related activity, we will first try to determine if that activity fits within an existing stack. And if not, we will create a new stack. So each stack gets a unique 4-digit sequence. So the first number will serve as a kind of identifier of the type of activity, whether that be state-sponsored or initial access brokers. And Sophos MDR Threat Intel team, we currently track roughly 45 different stacks that we've created, tracking intrusion activity, including ransomware affiliate activity, initial access broker campaigns, and nation-state activity. But once a stack is created, what we look to do is to add evidence from new incidents that align with the cluster characteristics. So as we get new incidents that may align, we want to add it to an existing stack. We look to identify open source intelligence that can help add context to the activity that we're seeing. And generally, we aim to build out the tactical, operational, and strategical elements of the activity clusters. And over time, what the great thing about clusters is we have the ability to split off or merge clusters as we or as other analysts in the field find additional data. But once the stack has a strong intelligence profile where we've verified evidence of sustained activity and we have a pretty high confidence in attribution, the stack will be promoted to a named entity/intrusion set. And at Sophos, we use shades of green to denote cybercriminal activity and shades of red to denote state-sponsored activity. And that's kind of the gist of how we go through the process of creating campaigns and intrusion sets.
Yeah, that's just amazing. And in terms of like, you hear a lot of customers, a lot of internal teams talking about indicators, observables. What exactly are those, and like, why do we spend so much time tracking those?
Yeah, so an observable is basically any technical information that can be used to detect a potential threat. So they're the digital fingerprints left behind on a system by an attacker that we can collect. And they can come in several different forms. There can be network-based observables like IPs and domains. There's file-based observables like hashes, or they can even be behavioral artifacts like repeated failed login attempts. And observable is often used synonymously with the phrase indicators of compromise, or IOCs, which technically are observables, but they're observables plus. They're combined with contextual information, such as related TTP context and relevant metadata. So instead of just a URL, which would be an observable, it's a URL that's used in a phishing campaign to drop a malicious installer file. So it's got that added context around it. And though observables or indicators like reused infrastructure, like IPs and domains, are very, very important to track, what's important to keep in mind is that many observables can be easily changed. So ideally, we want to look for higher quality indicators that aren't as easy for attackers to swap out. So the higher up on the pyramid of pain, the better.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we know a common complaint, we always get grumbles about low fidelity indicators, the hashes, the IP addresses that change all the time. What are the types of like correlations in your incidents that are the strongest? Like, what provide the highest confidence for that threat cluster?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when creating threat activity clusters, we don't necessarily focus on the more common aspects of attacker behavior, but rather we really try to focus on the more narrowly focused details that would be hard for someone who isn't the attacker or following a detailed attacker playbook to replicate. So for example, not only are we tracking which tools were used, but we also want to track how they were loaded, what they were used for, and what order it was used in relation to other tools. So some intrusion activity contains more unique fingerprints. So we place a higher weighted value on specific and higher quality indicators as points of comparison. And a couple things that you can look for here are, repeat use of the same files, passwords, and names. The more unique, the better. If you find, the username admin123, that might not be the most unique, but if you find, a long string of characters that is used across multiple different attacks, that can be a very strong indicator of there being a correlation. You can use custom tools and scripts that aren't likely to be used by multiple different actors. You can look at the repeat use of the same infrastructure or even consistencies in how that infrastructure is set up, if they're always using the same hosting provider or ASN. And lastly, one thing that you can really look for is the order of which tools and tactics occur and common TTPs that are consistently used in the same way. So you'll see a range of different tools that are commonly used in attacks, but if they specifically use a sequence of tools, that can be something that you can track and that is harder for them to switch between attacks. So it comes down to identifying the narrow details. And if we're looking at specific examples of how that works, here we have a table of very common broad tactics next to added specific details that can be used to map out notable patterns of activity, specifically by ransomware affiliates is what we're looking at here. So for example, an NTDS dump is common to dump credentials, but using this specific command to create a backup of ntds.dit to a folder named temp_logs, it's much more specific. Furthermore, lots of user accounts across incidents are created with admin privileges, but a much narrower subset are created with the username admin BAC and that specific password. So continuing down that trend, using batch scripts to deploy ransomware. Very common, but seeing the same batch files executed in the same order and performing the same functions is more notable. Lastly, modifying the registry, common persistence tactic, but seeing a PowerShell script dropped by the malware system BC, specifically creating a run key named SOCs, is a more tractable tactic. So those are the kind of things that we really try to narrow in on and identify when trying to create threat clusters.
Yeah, that's super insightful. So it really gives the audience kind of a very specific roadmap of things that are higher value, to focus their intelligence efforts on. So thank you. That's just amazing. Now for kind of like a TLDR though, what are some of the outcomes from a threat intelligence programs that maybe benefit the organization or a customer?
Yeah, so when it comes to the outcomes, I think knowledge of threat actor behavior and threat clusters can really help in creating better and more accurate detections that ideally can flag and block undesirable behavior in a network before ransomware can be deployed. So with Sophos MDR, we are dealing with a lot of ransomware cases, and the goal is to prevent that ransomware from ever being deployed. So having our thumb on very specific tactics that threat actors are using can help us be much more quick in our response. So on top of that, threat clusters allow us to be, provide more specific intelligence and recommendations and necessary areas of investigation for the Sophos incident response teams, which does lead to more comprehensive and faster investigations. And lastly, tracking creation and changes in clusters can help us identify wider trends in the cyber threat landscape in terms of TTPs that can be used against our customers. So there's multiple different benefits to doing threat activity clustering.
Oh, that's great. Well, there you go. You just heard it. This is the way. Threat clustering. Definitely a very great approach to kind of making sense of all this threat intelligence and incident data coming our way. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Morgan provided some great, insightful content here. If you guys enjoyed that, please like and subscribe to the channel. And then also we are going to have 4 more sessions. So the next one will be malware analysis. And with that, thank you very much.